let's get the show on the road. It would be great to have some of your questions and prompts. Please try and get those in early in the show, and we will try and cover those issues as soon as we possibly can. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we will discuss the importance of protecting America's endangered wildlife and the implications for our ecosystems with our special guest, Collin O'Mara, President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. A reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results and questions submitted to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which will be much appreciated, will be included in our discussion. So, Collin, thank you so much for joining us. I see you're in the wilds of America, and I see behind you the trail leading off. So it's great to interrupt your hike and be able to chat about the fact that a third of America's species, a third of those species that live in water and on land risk extinction. And we all know that all species are affected by climate change. I was looking at some of the statistics surrounding the impact of the wildfires that are spreading across the West on wildlife, and it's just incredibly devastating. So, Collin, your microphone is muted for now, but if you can unmute, help us understand how the National Wildlife Federation works to prevent the death and disappearance of whole categories of American wildlife.
Yeah, no, first of all, Mark, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the invitation. And you set it up perfectly. I mean, right now, about 1/3 of all species are at heightened risk of extinction in the US. We've done a remarkable job saving the species that we hunt and fish, and also a pretty good job of saving species that are on the brink of extinction. But it's kind of everything else that we're lacking. And so the National Wildlife Federation was created in 1936. It was actually came out of a convening by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where he basically brought folks together from across the country to talk about the future of wildlife resources, which at the time, this is at the height of the Depression, were in kind of rough shape. It's hard to imagine today, but there weren't that many deer on the landscape. The freshwater fish populations had collapsed. The bison had already been shot off the plains. The passenger pigeons had been shot out of the sky. And so the idea was to kind of come together and bring folks from all different backgrounds, not just conservationists, but kind of sportsmen and sportswomen, hunters, anglers, farmers, ranchers, 4-H clubs, garden clubs. I mean, the early Audubon Society members, the early Sierra Club members, early Ducks Unlimited, folks that founded Ducks Unlimited were there. And at the end of this 3-day session, they basically said, let's become an organization. Let's actually organize. And the idea was to be a full-blown federation. So we have affiliates in all 53 states, or 50 states, and then the 3 of the territories. And really, I mean, we're 6 million strong. We'd love to have all your followers join us too. But it spans the political spectrum. I got, about 35% of my members are Republicans, about 38% are Democrats. At a time when we're pretty divided as a country, this seems to be an area that folks can still come together. And at the same time, to your point, that, if we don't get ahead of some of the massive impacts we're seeing in the landscape now, as climate change is affecting everything from the horrific fires and drought we're seeing in the West, the floods and the hurricanes that we're seeing in the East, that the impacts on wildlife are pretty devastating. And so right now we're at a moment where we have to act urgently because the crisis is intensifying.
I think one of the things that I'd like to really discuss a lot more is this idea of the conservation mission that you have is in everybody's interest, every American's interest. It doesn't really matter whether you're living in a city or you're living in a rural area. It doesn't matter if you're a farmer and rancher, or if you are a construction worker, or if you are working in tech. This is really important in that origin of being very inclusive and focused on America and the nature of America and the nature of our relationship with our natural world is so important. So let's go back to this whole idea of inclusivity, because so much of the conservation arena is really defined by what you're against, right? If you have a business interest, you're obviously going to be against the environmentalists. If you're an environmentalist, you're obviously going to be suing hunters, right? But that's not so obvious when you have an organization where you're saying, okay, let's get together and talk about what our relationship is as a country, as a people, to these species, right? Do we want to live in an America where there is nothing wild? Or where wild is kind of restricted to little conservation parks. So let's talk about how you actually operate and how you ensure that that balance is maintained through your history, because you've been around for such a long time. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is focusing on the commonalities, right? I mean, I often say, like, when we save wildlife, we save ourselves. And what I mean by that is that, we're also a species, right? Like, we need healthy air, we need clean water. We
And
need.
there's a food chain, right? I mean, there is a
Yeah.
natural food chain. If we disrupt insects, for example, it's going to have a huge amount of impact downstream.
Yeah, well, so let's use that example. So, I mean, if right now, about half of pollinator populations are in trouble across the country. I mean, in about one of every three bites of food we eat is from pollinated, fruits or vegetables or the like. And so, I mean, it has massive impacts on our day-to-day life. And like you said, I mean, I do think the dichotomy in the 70s and 80s in particular was very much environment versus business, and you couldn't have both. I think we're trying to show, like, we don't have a choice. Like, we need both. Places that have healthier natural resources are able to withstand, the fires and floods more, because you have natural systems to absorb, some of the impacts in real ways. Places that have healthier natural resources have stronger outdoor recreation economies. Folks like to visit places that have healthy natural resources and abundant wildlife. Young people are deciding increasingly where to live first and where to work second. And in this increased world, I mean, we're doing this on Zoom right now. In a teleworking reality for a lot of young professionals, they can live anywhere they want. And so they want to be in places where, they have healthy natural resources. And so it's in people's economic interests, it's in their kind of personal health interest, as well as I would argue we have a kind of a moral responsibility to protect the species that we're blessed with. But it's trying to find those sweet spots. And, the thing that's interesting for me is, the national narrative so often that, like, Democrats are good on these issues or Republicans are bad on that. And it's so much more complicated. I mean, one of the most bipartisan series of wins of the last few years in the Congress have actually been over conservation. It's been funding for our national parks, funding for our wildlife refuges, funding for land acquisitions in local parks. Now, there's still a huge political divide on things like regulation and the role of, like, EPA and, like, those kind of questions. But it's more of a question of means as opposed to ends. And so I think the more I can focus on that 80% that we can agree on and kind of leave the tails of the kind of the 10% of areas on both extremes where we disagree, we can still move some big things, because frankly, we're at a time we can't afford to be so pure that we're losing. When people fight, wildlife loses.
Yeah, well, look at Florida. Florida has a huge environmental tourism or environmentally connected tourism industry, and so conservation of the Everglades and those sanctuaries for birds and other wildlife is a big part. Look at what happened down in the Gulf in Louisiana, where the fishing industry is so incredibly invested in the environmental quality. I want to also get to how you compose your board, because over time organizations are composed of people. So if you're going to maintain balance, you have to have balance in your board, you have to have balance in your staff, and representation is also important. We're past the point where we can decide that in the environmental movement that we can be talking just to the people who founded the movement, who are very often white, male, and in power and landed and so on. How do you ensure through the mix of people that you bring into your board that you have these different groups, these different constituencies, different ethnicities, different interests, rural, business, environmental scientists, and so on? How do you make sure that is represented on your staff and your board?
Yeah, no, and I'll get to that just a second. I mean, I think on your first point around, like, Florida's a perfect example, right? Where, like, the blue-green algae, the red tide. I mean, the folks that are screaming for clean water the loudest are folks that have outdoor charter boat companies, the hotels. I mean, it's folks on Sanibel Island, right? And so, like, it's changing the conversation. So it's not just like the greenies, right, coming in saying this is important. It's it's an economic necessity, not kind of an environmental nicety, if you will. And for us, I mean, like, we're committed to being a 21st century organization, and you can't be a modern organization, as you said, unless you represent the full diversity of the country. And we have had, if you look at the board chairs of the federation over its 80-year history, you got about 70 years of 65 years of mostly white folks, and then pretty good diversity in the last few years. And we're one of the first national nonprofits to have a Latino board chair right now. We've had, we've had interesting kind of leadership evolve over the last few years. But about almost 30% of our board are folks of color. We have representation from tribes. We have representation from leaders in the Black community, leaders in the Latino community, Pacific Island leaders as well, Native Hawaiian, and so we have a pretty big board organizationally. We're about 36 right now, I think, 35 or 36. But our board is a little different than most in that half of our board members actually come from our affiliates. So we're elected almost more like a labor structure, in that the local districts actually send delegates that come from their regions, and so trying to make sure that we're having that level of diversity across the board requires everyone being bought in on this vision that inclusivity and kind of reaching true
it's
equity.
Not the worst way to go, right? When
Right.
people have to be elected, they have to communicate how they think to others, and so constituents get to engage in dialogue. That dialogue itself really does advance. And the other piece that I think is really interesting about your organization is that it is essentially a coalition that depends on being able to serve members who have divergent interests, but that encourages everybody to talk about where those interests diverge and where there might be commonalities. So if it doesn't get out of hand into what becomes a political food fight, which is what we so often have in our government, it can be incredibly productive. So let's talk a little bit about how you translate that into action, how you actually create impact through that coalition building. Could you just talk about some of the programs that you've been able to enact over the last couple of years?
Yeah, and this is where it all connects, because I do think so. Our governance structure, we actually have an annual meeting every year where all of our 50 state affiliates and our territorial affiliates get together and actually pass resolutions. I mean, they actually have the debate. I mean, so you'll have the North Dakota folks and the West Virginia folks arguing with the California folks and the Massachusetts folks, right? I mean, you'll have these kind of interesting, and that informs a lot of our work, because we kind of see where that kind of the common ground is. We see where those opportunities are, and that does inform a lot of our work. I mean, one of the areas that we've been spending a lot of time on lately is really trying to elevate the environmental justice work, because and folks often use the analogy of the canary in the coal mine. I mean, we do have sacrifice zones in this country that have suffered just the greatest level of degradation, the greatest amount of pollution. Obviously, it maps very closely with levels of poverty, levels of communities of color. And so Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali is our Vice President for Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization and Climate, and in his portfolio, really trying to make sure those local solutions are being brought to the national level. There's great work going on all across the country, and because of the access that we have to elected officials in the White House and in the Congress and the like, making sure those voices are told, but not again appropriating the ideas, but really letting folks speak for themselves and just kind of opening doors. And a lot of the things you're seeing in the infrastructure package right now, both the kind of the bipartisan one as well as the reconciliation package, were informed by those conversations. Huge focus right now on the wildlife side around investing in proactive collaborative work. We have a bit of a train wreck coming, and this gets back to your comments at the top. The number of species that are at risk right now is massive. And we have 1,600 species that are already listed on the Endangered Species Act. You got another couple thousand in the queue. If we don't invest in their habitat, we can't regulate our way out of this problem. So there's an act called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That's a huge priority for us. It's led by Roy Blunt, a Republican from Missouri, and Martin Heinrich, a Democrat from New Mexico, as well as Debbie Dingell, a Democrat from Michigan, and Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican from Nebraska. And completely bipartisan, but the idea is to invest in proactive collaborative work. And it's fascinating that I've got some of the most conservative members of Congress and some of the most progressive members of Congress all working together on this, because they're all saying, look, this is a better way to save wildlife than fighting it on the courts.
Americans, I mean, come on. Why does everything have to be about political party? There are common interests that we have here, and if we can just talk about those common interests, we can solve a lot of problems. We just asked this question where we said, what do you think is the top driver of wildlife extinctions? And we included some of the answers that in previous times we would have probably gotten a lot of votes, right? Pollution, climate change, non-human factors, and so on and so forth. 100% of the people who responded say it's human development of land and water and loss of habitat. So let's focus on that idea: human development of on land and water and loss of habitat. So when you have humans who are just sort of doing their everyday life, right? Business, I just bought a product and it's a food product that's in a little plastic tray that comes out of a box, paper box. You got plastic and you got paper box, and it's wrapped in plastic. And then it comes in a bigger box that then is wrapped in shrink wrap all around to protect it from humidity. And it's flown on an airplane from some destination, and it lands in my Costco or whatever. So that's my normal day, right? If I'm a real estate developer, I'm developing stuff. If I'm a road builder, I'm building roads. When we talk about solving this problem of human development on land and water, right, and the impact that we have, how do we get us all to act differently? How do we get me to act differently as a consumer?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges is that we've for a long time just had this kind of insatiable demand for more and more goods, and kind of cheaper and cheaper goods, and for the most part, we haven't had the real conversation about like the end of life of a lot of the products. We were actually pretty far behind other parts of the world, and then we've seen kind of massive efforts in recycling, which are fantastic. There's not enough markets for a lot of the materials at this point, so we're having things end up in ports that don't really have anywhere to go. And I think that at this point, we have to be talking about the kind of source reduction and kind of reuse in a major way. And again, it's funny. I was at a press conference a few years ago. We were announcing this huge, kind of composting operation, trying to have more organic waste being used instead of landfilled, and reducing methane emissions and having better soil and the like. And my grandmother at the time at the event said to me afterwards, she's like, I don't know why y'all think this is so fancy. Like, we had slop buckets in the 30s. Like, this isn't anything innovative. And so in some ways, I think, like, thinking back, kind of to some of the practices of the past, and at the same time recognizing we have these huge systemic drivers, right? I mean, the amount of pollution coming out of like the fossil fuel industry, the kind of the insatiable demand for kind of greenfield development instead of having to do more like brownfield development and kind of redevelopment in cities. I mean, the way that we kind of allow sprawl to kind of get out of control in a lot of places instead of having more density. So there's a lot of moving pieces. I think one of the things that we push for is, as much as I want the big systemic changes, I also want to be focused on those individual place-based projects where there's a little tweak, right? It's saving a little space for nature. Reconnecting some habitat, having corridors or crossings that connect highways. I mean, we got 4 million miles of additional highways in this country over the last 50 years. I mean, like, those are the kinds of pieces, but it does take everyone. And at the same time, we have to address the systemic drivers that kind of push us towards this ever and ever demanding need for more and more natural resources at the expense of any kind of sustainable outlook.
So what you're saying is we are the drivers of the harm, and if we're going to actually have harm reduction, we've got to stop driving the harm.
That's right. Yeah, and look, and I think, obviously climate overlays all of this because to the question in the poll, right? I mean, habitat loss is by far the biggest driver, and habitat degradation and fragmentation. But we have invasive species, we have pollution, we have all kinds of challenges with emerging diseases. And then you have climate change that's kind of accelerating all of that. So affecting water quantity levels in some places, destroying habitat in other places, moving temperature ranges. But we are kind of the ones we've been waiting for, right? I mean, that old adage, like, it's going to take a collective action. The government alone can't solve this. Like, individuals are going to have to, whether it's a small creature like the monarch butterfly or a big creature like the bison, and kind of everything in between.
What are the largest challenges and the highest priority challenges, either by species or by the type of program, that really should receive disproportionate investment?
I mean, I do think that we've spent a lot of time and resources on the species we hunt and fish, and to great outcomes. I mean, our duck populations are healthy. I mean, they're up 56% over the last 40 years when everything else has kind of crashed. Deer populations are insane pretty much everywhere.
Right.
I worry about the smaller species. I worry about invertebrates. I worry about pollinators in particular. I worry about the songbirds and the forest birds and the shorebirds that just don't get the same amount of attention.
So invertebrates. Examples would include.
Yeah, so a lot of insects, a lot of organisms that are critical in the food chain, right? In the kind of the food
Really
web.
tiny,
Yeah.
right? The grasshoppers that the birds eat, and
healthy caterpillars, right? That are important for bird populations, and caterpillar
Right.
populations decline because you don't have native trees. I mean, a lot of the populations of amphibians and reptiles right now don't receive a lot of attention, but are incredibly important. I mean, the role that frogs play in the system, the role that salamanders and snakes and turtles. I mean, like, there's a whole range of species, and most of that work, like, most of the species could be saved with more investment. I mean, there's some kind of bigger shifts with climate, but a friend of mine uses this great analogy where it's like we're flying an airplane, right? You start taking off individual bolts, and you don't know like which individual bolt is going to have the whole thing collapse. But that's kind of what the food web is like, right? Like, if you don't know like which piece, if it gets pulled out, is going to cause collapse. like we don't want to be playing roulette with our future when there's investments we can make that are very cost effective that could save all the species.
We just finished a poll in which we asked how much money should we commit to improving the survival chances of American species. And it split basically 60-40. 60% said we should spend an amount that we all notice through increased taxes. And the other said we should allocate money, we should reallocate money, but no new taxes. Could you talk about this whole idea of us spending money, more money, right? The no new taxes thing is really convenient, right? It's sort of like we're not going to really feel it, but it's a good thing to spend money on, right? Whereas when the reason why we asked the first question was, we're going to have to spend some money. We're going to be actually taxed more. How much is it worth to you? So could you talk a little bit about this notion of, do we actually have to, as Americans, sacrifice something for our wildlife? And what is that calculus? How do your members think about that calculus?
Yeah, I mean, right now we spend less than 0.5% of the federal budget on kind of natural resources. I mean, it's a staggeringly small number across the entire portfolio. And I would argue that, like, you could actually do, I mean, I think it's sort of a false choice. I mean, I think we can actually spend the amount we need to within existing resources. I mean, I think we could save the vast majority of the 12,000 species of greatest conservation need for about $1.4 billion a year, which sounds like a big number to like me and you, but like in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing, right? I mean, it's a fraction of
1.4 billion, where we have a $1 trillion infrastructure budget, exactly, and a 3.5 human infrastructure budget, yeah, whatever you want to call it, in the offing. I'm not sure that. What did you say? 1.5 billion?
If we could have 1.4 a year dedicated to like kind of the full diversity of wildlife, investors in the states, a few $100 million more for the federal government to help recover listed species already. I mean, for less. I mean, it's a fraction of nothing. And the bill that I mentioned before, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, would actually do that. It would dedicate that kind of funding because at the end of the day, like, it's that sustained investment that's going to be needed. But it really is a fraction of nothing. I mean, we've been basically funding the recovery of species we hunt and fish through an existing excise tax on ammunition and firearms and fishing tackle for 50 years in one case, 70 years in one case, 90 years in the other case. And again, those kind of models are just applying existing revenues towards wildlife. So folks don't really feel it, but they're getting the benefit. The other thing I'd say to your listeners, though, is that we're already paying for it. Right. So like when a species has to be listed, there's economic impacts from that. When habitat gets decimated, there's cost to that. So we're just incredibly penny wise and pound stupid. Like, it's just like we're not making the upfront investments. So then we end up paying the catastrophic costs in the back end, where that ounce of prevention really is worth that pound of cure.
I appreciate your pointing to the 1.5 billion, but I personally don't believe it. I personally have a view that until we all change our behaviors, our small behaviors, and I cited my own example, the car that I drive, the products that I purchase, even what I plant in my garden, until we actually change our behaviors, the drivers of these changes, that driver, which is us, isn't going to be addressed. So spending $1.5 billion on the back end to try and repair some past harm and try to ameliorate future harm that we do, it just seems to me to be the wrong way to look at the solution. It's a component, certainly, but in terms of how your various component parts, your affiliates, actually function. How do they function within their individual markets? Do they each try and carry parts of this message, and do you use them as kind of, you talked about learning from them and facilitating in communication, but do you also function a little bit as a galvanizing force to create models of behavior or ideas that could be deployed, each according to their own lights? So that on a local level, we're all changing ourselves in these small ways that might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets back to your last question, right? It's both and. And so like we sort of function like NATO. So like if there's federal opportunities, everyone will kind of come together and kind of work to pass legislation together, like the one I mentioned. And again, that legislation is to get us to a point where species are surviving. That's not to get to thriving like you're talking about, where we're actually doing everyone's doing the hard work themselves to have habitat in their backyards and the like. But then there's also great work going on in every state. And so in one state it might be a campaign around wildlife corridors. Another place it might be a fresh water campaign or a clean water campaign. And somebody else it might be around litter and cleanups and outdoor recreation. I mean, and the idea is that we provide additional firepower on the ground to support those efforts. Really, a lot of sharing best practices and getting folks, hey, folks in Minnesota are thinking about this, like that aligns with something that Arkansas was doing 2 years ago. Let's learn from each other what worked, what didn't. And so like the camaraderie that comes from having that kind of like living network where folks are talking, we call it kind of our one federation, where we're really trying to all work together all the time, like in addition to the thousands of other partners we work with on the ground. But this idea that most of the big questions are being dealt with somewhere else, right? So we can just like learn from like what's working and replicate it and scale it. That's one of the best ways to drive change everywhere in the country.
When you get to the policy area, you do dip your toe into the political waters. You were referring to some of the legislation that you were advancing, and you referred to bipartisan supporters both in the Senate and in the House. Are there other areas where you are engaged in political advocacy, or what would be called political advocacy, that we should all know about?
Yeah, so I mean, we have one of the larger kind of teams of folks kind of focusing on legislation of any of the NGOs in the country, and and we're working on we talked about the wildlife funding and some of the environmental justice work, but I mean, huge teams around water, huge teams around agriculture, forestry, looking at the big regional water programs. A lot of focus right now on infrastructure, of course, and making sure it's as kind of wildlife friendly and kind of climate smart as possible. I mean, we're doing more and more in the clean
and it's
energy
all about
space.
sustainable ecosystems, right?
Exactly.
You don't have an agenda beyond a healthy ecosystem that is a great habitat for wildlife, healthy wildlife populations. That's your entire agenda, right?
Exactly, and then making the case that those systems are actually going to help save us, right? They're going to make us more resilient to these fires and floods and other pieces. And the nice thing is that that's a bipartisan message, right? I mean, there's folks that are saying, look, we need healthier forests because the kind of the disrepair we're seeing in our forests is contributing to these massive mega fires. Now, climate is a huge part of it too, and obviously invasive species and the like. But like, it's a way to bring people together. And I think one of the things we try to kind of make the case that like there is no Republican, white-tailed deer, there's no Democratic, smallmouth bass, as a friend of mine says. And that these things shouldn't be partisan, as I think you've laid out nicely over this interview.
So we just completed another poll, and after this, I'm going to give you sort of a last word. I mean, this has just been such a fascinating discussion. The last poll we asked, and we forced people into a single choice. We asked, what should we be doing? What should we each be doing to improve the chances for survival of America's wildlife? And we had a number of people who said educate ourselves and reduce our end use of fossil fuels, but the greatest answer, which is 56%, was implement legislation and policies that protect wildlife. It seems that we're ready as a country to actually do stuff. Right now, there is some controversy as to whether we're going to actually have to make a financial sacrifice, in other words, spend more to do stuff. But it looks like that there is some sort of a consensus building that it is part of our national identity to have a healthy wild ecosystem. So could you, as you take us out, because we're coming to the end of our 30 minutes, could you give us all a sense of what we could do today and tomorrow, aside from writing you a check, which we're all welcome to do. But what can we do on a micro level? How can we get involved? If you were going to whisper in our ears and then we took your advice, what would that advice be?
Yeah, I'd ask each of you to do three things. And I think the first thing is, kind of the act locally. There's great opportunities to do a little bit of habitat restoration.
Act locally.
Yeah, I mean, in my first ask is just, if there's an opportunity to plant a native plant, have a little milkweed for a monarch, have a little, have some native, coneflowers or for pollinators. Just do something active on whether you have a yard or even just a windowsill or just a box. I mean, anything in between. Doing a little action goes a long way, and it actually makes a difference. It's not just symbolic. It actually will help. with the numbers. So that's the first thing. The second thing is spend more time outdoors. I mean, get especially with family and friends that don't spend time outdoors. Like just getting them to appreciate. I think the pandemic actually helped because I think, like, look, as we become more and more attached to our damn phones and our, and living on Zoom screens all the time, I worry that some of the gains for folks spending more time in nature are being lost a little bit, especially to get back in their cars and as we come out of the pandemic. But I think that, we only protect what we love. And so I think that connection is important. And then the third thing is to your point, is on the advocacy side, like letting your local elected officials know that this is important. Wildlife can't speak for themselves, so we have to. And so they don't vote, they don't write checks. And so at the end of the day, it's going to take folks. And I mean, the most important thing right now is this Recovering America's Wildlife Act that I've mentioned a few times. I mean, we haven't had a signature in wildlife piece of legislation in this country since the Endangered Species Act passed in 1973. This would be the game changer. And again, it's not to get, this is basically to make sure all the species survive. Then the next level is kind of getting to the level of connected ecosystems that we're going to need. But this is a huge win. It's definitely in play for this Congress. It could easily get done. I would encourage everyone to go to the nwf.org website. It's NWF, National Wildlife Federation, nwf.org website. You can learn more about it. You can reach out to me, and we'd love to have you get involved. And then also, getting involved with your state affiliates. If there's things you're concerned about in your particular state or your community, every one of our 50 affiliates would love to have folks, involved for volunteer projects or ideas or advocacy. Lots of opportunities to make a difference.
Well, this has just been great. I would add a fourth element to your list of free. Let's just talk to each other, because we're going to find that we agree on a lot more than we think. And once we reach agreement, once we educate each other on our various positions, and we start to find the things that we can agree on, we can actually take action that we agree are in mutual interests. Collin O'Mara, President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, thank you so much for sharing the work of your organization. Please thank your board, thank your staff, thank your donors, thank your communities and your affiliates. It's just wonderful that you were able to be here today to share some of the work that you do.
Thanks again for having me. It's great to be with you.
Everybody have a great day. Mask up, stay safe.